Good morning, everyone. Hi, and welcome to the second webinar in our series, Interrogating Critical Minerals, co-hosted by Above Ground and MiningWatch Canada. Before we get started, please note that this will be a webinar with presentations in English and French. We have interpretation in these languages, which can be accessed by clicking on the globe at the bottom of your screen and selecting your choice of language. Bonjour et bienvenue à tout le monde au deuxième webinaire de notre série
Hello and
Interrogeant
welcome
le
everyone to
critique,
the
show
second
organisé
webinar
par
in
Above
our
Ground et
Interrogating Critical
MiningWatch
Minerals
Canada.
event
Nous
series.
avons
It's
prévu des
co-organized by Above
services
Ground and
d'interprétation en
MiningWatch
anglais
Canada.
et en français.
We
Pour
have
y
interpretation
accéder,
services for
cliquez
this
sur le globe
webinar. To
au bas de
access
votre
them, you
écran
can click on
et
the globe
sélectionnez la
icon
langue de
at the
votre choix.
bottom of your screen and select the language of your choice.
All right, if you missed our first webinar in this series, which was called Indigenous Perspectives on the Global Critical Minerals Rush, you can find it on Mining Watch's YouTube page, and we will share a link to that in the chat. A reminder that the final event of this series is a civil society strategizing session on February 11th, which is limited to civil society actors working on corporate accountability, climate justice, or human rights issues, and a link to register will also be shared in the chat. Today's webinar is called Canada's Approach to Critical Minerals at Home and Abroad. As so-called critical minerals become a central focus of the Canadian government, we want to go deeper into understanding Canada's approach and the context in which it is unfolding. We will hear from four speakers who will both explain this approach and offer various perspectives on it. Thank you in advance to all of our panelists for being here and sharing with us today. So we will answer any questions at the end of all presentations, and in the meantime, you can use the Q&A function to ask your questions at any point. Our first speaker is Nicole Uher, Deputy Director of the Critical Minerals Centre of Excellence based at Natural Resources Canada. Since joining Natural Resources Canada in 2019, she has led a team responsible for the development and implementation of the Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you so much. I'm just getting my screen organized here. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you all today. And I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards and also keen to see the remarks and presentations from the other panelists. I thought I would begin the presentation today with just a brief overview of Canada's minerals and metals sector writ large, just to set the scene. I think the map on the right-hand side is always quite impressive to me, even after all these years being in the space. Oh, the presentation just disappeared. There it is. Thank you. As you can see, critical minerals and metals writ large offers quite an opportunity across the entire country from coast to coast to coast. Canada produces 60 minerals and metals at almost 200 mines and thousands of quarries across all provinces and territories. The sector contributes significantly to Canada's GDP, exports, and job creation and employment. And we see this most notably in the three territories where mining remains a key economic driver in the north. One thing I really want to flag is Canada's world-leading status as an environmental, social, and governance performer and adopter of key standards. And as I go through my presentation, you'll see this embedded through the design of the strategy itself. Next slide, please. So in terms of critical minerals specifically, I'm sure this group is well familiar given all the sessions you've dedicated to this, but we're really seeing them grow in importance given their role in modern technologies, both with respect to clean energy technologies like batteries and wind turbines, but also in advanced manufacturing and increasingly the defense space. Canada, as well as a number of countries around the world, have taken steps to release their own critical minerals lists to guide investment and support value chain development. With respect to Canada's list, in order to be deemed critical, a mineral must meet both of the following criteria. The supply chain is threatened, and there is a reasonable chance that the mineral could be produced by Canada. In addition to that, the commodity must meet one of the following criteria: be essential to Canada's economic or national security, be required for the national transition to a sustainable, low carbon and digital economy, or position Canada as a sustainable and strategic partner within global supply chains. The list you see reflected on the right-hand side of your screen was updated recently to include an additional 3 minerals, and it remains our objective to update the list about every 3 years to ensure that it remains reflective of the current operating environment. Next slide, please. So turning our attention to the federal strategy, it was released in 2022 and backed by an initial federal investment of about $3.8 billion. Throughout the public strategy, you will see a strong emphasis on advancing ESG priorities and circular solutions while supporting Canada's commitment to human rights through enhanced transparency and traceability throughout the supply chain. In addition, there are funding initiatives under the strategy aimed at expanding recycling capacity and advancing technologies to recover critical minerals from mine waste, tailings, and end-of-life products, turning waste streams into new sources of value. The strategy itself is kind of insider baseball language, what we like to call a horizontal initiative, which means that while NRCan leads the strategy, we work very closely with 4 partner departments: ISED, NRC, National Research Council, CERNAC, and Transport Canada. In addition to that, we have a robust governance framework in place that involves over 15 federal departments and agencies who all have a mandate and role in the critical minerals space to ensure that we are sharing information and supporting collaboration, coordination, and alignment across our various activities. I'm pleased to say that since the launch of the strategy in 2022, we have seen some notable progress. In the first year of implementation alone, we saw a 15% increase in the domestic production of key critical minerals. However, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen there, we recognize that there's still a lot of work left to do in this space. Demand continues to outpace supply, and in Canada specifically, we will have to double our production by 2040 just to meet domestic demand. Next slide, please. So I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my remarks today walking you through just a handful of the funding initiatives under the strategy that I thought might be of most interest to this group. But there's definitely more, so would welcome any questions or feedback on the ones that are not covered today. I'll start first with the Critical Minerals Geoscience and Data Initiative, which supports fundamental geoscience research to understand Canada's critical mineral sources and accelerate discovery and development through the creation of green economic pathways, or what we consider to be areas with high geological potential and the lowest ESG risks. The program is supporting this through 2 streams: an internal federal research and development avenue focused on 6 priority minerals, and a second avenue, which is a contribution program working with the provinces and territories. One of the main strategic goals of the program was to develop tools for industry to integrate ESG considerations during exploration, thereby reducing project risks and potential delays. To that end, the program has supported the creation of a geospatial ESG ranking tool and a national scale mineral potential map for the 6 priority critical minerals. The geospatial tool allows users to enter coordinates and generate ESG ranking values for their areas of interest. The mineral potential maps depict areas with high mineral potential. By combining these tools, users can identify regions that have the lowest ESG-related risks and highest geological potential. Next slide. Moving on to the Critical Minerals Research, Development, and Demonstration Program, which is intended to support the development of innovative processing technologies for the critical minerals industry, which will help advance Canadian mining projects towards production and further develop domestic critical mineral value chains. This program in particular plays a strategic role in enabling the midstream segment of critical mineral value chains. This includes testing and validating processing technologies that improve efficiency, reduce emissions, and increase the competitiveness of Canadian producers. Funding for projects aims to address challenges in extraction, magnet recycling, and low carbon processing, and helps to move technologies closer to market. Through this program, NRCan is also looking for opportunities for international collaboration as we develop guidelines and possible standards for this space. As an example, Canada is working with partnering countries on critical mineral recovery via the International Energy Agency's Technology Collaboration Program. Next slide. The Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund, one of the largest funding programs that was announced as part of the strategy at $1.5 billion, to date, has announced over $300 million in funding for the development and deployment of 33 clean energy and transportation infrastructure projects necessary to enable the sustainable development and expansion of critical minerals in Canada. This includes $1.5 million for 18 Indigenous grants. To provide an example of the type of projects that have been funded, there was a joint investment with the government of British Columbia to upgrade key highway infrastructure in the northwest region of the province and providing funding to the government of the Northwest Territories for that territory's hydro generating capacity. The CMIF's second call for proposals will provide up to $500 million in contribution funding for clean energy and transportation infrastructure. Intake for shovel-ready projects remains open until March 4th of this year. In addition, a $3 million call for proposals for grants that support Indigenous engagement and participation in critical mineral infrastructure projects closed in December of last year. The intake was met with very high interest and applications are currently being assessed. I did also just want to take a moment to point to the Budget 2025 announcement last fall regarding the First and Last Mile Fund, which will subsume and replace the existing CMIF and provide a total back up to that initial $1.5 billion, running until 2030. The fund will scope in a broader suite of activities to support critical minerals development, including infrastructure to enable midstream processing and onward market access. And we're hoping to see more coming publicly on that fund in the next few months. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to end my remarks today by touching on one of the areas of focus of the strategy, which is advancing Indigenous economic reconciliation. It's key to the strategy to ensure that Indigenous communities have the opportunities, capacity, and resources to meaningfully participate in projects throughout the value chain. Some programs, such as the Northern Regulatory Initiative, the Indigenous Natural Resource Partnership Program, and the Indigenous Grants Stream under CMIF, support Indigenous involvement by providing targeted funding and capacity building support. These investments help strengthen community engagement, planning, and environmental stewardship, ensuring projects proceed in ways that respect Indigenous rights, interests, and treaty relationships. Advancing Indigenous economic reconciliation remains essential to Canada's broader critical minerals strategy. It supports shared prosperity, builds stronger partnerships with Indigenous governments and organizations, and helps ensure responsible resource development. That brings me to the end of my remarks today, but I do look forward to the discussion that will follow and would be happy to elaborate further on any of these points. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Nicole, for this important overview. Next, we have Leah Gilbert Morris, the Vice President of Public Affairs and International Relations at Export Development Canada, who is going to tell us about Canada's Export Credit Agency and their role in supporting critical minerals projects, both inside and outside of Canada. Go ahead, Leah.
Thanks, Georgina. Bonjour tout le monde. Bon matin, bon après-midi.
Hello, everyone.
On where you are. Georgina, can I just do an audio check? Can you hear me?
Yes, it went a little funny there, but I think we hear you okay now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Excellent. So I think we can jump straight to slide 3. And I will give a bit of detail about what Export Development Canada, or EDC, is. We are not necessarily an easy entity to understand, but hopefully we can simply explain it here this morning, and happy to take questions. So Export Development Canada, for those who don't know, is Canada's official export credit agency. We are an organization that has been around for over 80 years. And what we do is we help Canadian companies navigate international markets. We help enable them to grow their trade around the world and enter into new markets across a whole range of sectors. About 100 countries around the world have an official export credit agency. Their models are all different. And here in Canada, EDC's model is such that we are a Crown corporation. We are a financial institution that is owned by the Government of Canada. So the Government of Canada is, at the end of the day, our shareholder, and they give us broad policy direction. But otherwise, EDC is a financially self-sustaining financial institution that operates under commercial principles. Much of our business is done in partnership by design with other financial institutions and with other export credit agencies around the world, and with collaboration when relevant from or with the Government of Canada. Most simply, our mandate is to support and develop Canada's export trade and Canadian capacity to engage in that trade and respond to international business opportunities. Next slide, please. To crystallize this with a few explanations, when I say we are a financial institution, what that means is we offer financing solutions. So that means straight loans, debt. It could be guarantees and guaranteeing commercial banks and their lending to Canadian businesses. Or it could be equity investments, taking early ownership in funds or companies that are on an export or trade strategic trajectory. We offer a range of insurance solutions. This could be contract insurance bonding, germane to the mining sector, could be reclamation bonding support, could be something as simple as accounts receivable insurance, for example. We offer as well a host of knowledge solution, and the intent here is to help companies understand what their export opportunities are, to help connect them into buyer relationships around the world, to help them grow their business opportunities and hone and refine their trade strategies. And we do that through a series of in-house expertise, including with respect to market knowledge, economic understanding, sectoral expertise, and business know-how. I think I will go to slide 5. Thank you. What I like about this slide is that it shows that, you're hearing this morning from 2 of the federal entities, one a department of the government of Canada, NRCan, and another a Crown Corporation. But there's very many members of the federal Canadian family that collaborate in the critical minerals space. And on this slide, you see a mix of other Crown corporations, like the Canadian Commercial Corporation or the Business Development Bank of Canada. And you see other federal departments that we work closely with. So in EDC's case, we report to the Minister of the Minister of Trade, International Trade, Minister Sidhu, and Global Affairs Canada. That is where our broad policy direction comes from. And we work closely with NRCan colleagues, Finance Canada colleagues, and others. I think what this map illustrates is that there are a number of different entities with differing mandates and different solutions that they bring to bear to help Canada tackle various, not just trade, but broad economic security objectives. Next slide, please. Or actually, we'll go straight to slide 7. So our NRCan colleagues and I should have collaborated on our slide deck in advance. I won't say too much more about this one because you've heard already from Nicole this morning. However, what I will say is that when we say that EDC is aligned to Canada, to the federal government's policy direction, we do look at the Canadian critical minerals strategy for our broad strategic objectives. We want to make sure that we are working towards the broad objectives that the Canadian government has set, and we do so in ways that are aligned to EDC's strategic objectives and specific capabilities. Next slide, please. I think we've already heard as well a bit of the global context and why critical minerals are important. So I won't repeat that content, but I will say that EDC has an important role to play in terms of enabling critical minerals development in Canada. We have had decades of bench strength in the mining sector, in both international mining operations as well as mining in Canada. That includes the sectors that are peripheral to mining, particularly infrastructure and a broad series of tangential industries. I mentioned earlier that we collaborate closely with commercial banks and other private sector financial entities. Traditional mining is broadly financeable. Critical minerals projects, however, especially in the upstream and midstream segments, continue to face significant financing gaps. There are gaps in the market, the commercial market, when it comes to offering long tenors, early stage risk tolerance, or the very large debt capacity that sometimes these projects may require. And EDC is able to help be one of the entities that fills this market gap. With our longer term financing, our ability to support earlier stage development, we are able to enable domestic processing capacity and secure feedstock through our innovative offtake linked solutions. If some of that sounds a bit jargony, I'll give you some examples in just a moment. I think it actually might help if we go to the next slide. There we go. So our strategy, which is a sort of a subset and falls in part from the federal critical mineral strategy, is to help accelerate, firstly, Canadian projects, where we aim to bring more critical minerals projects online in support of Canada's strategic priorities. We recognize that these projects may carry higher risks than conventional mining operations, and we've introduced targeted measures to better support high-risk, high-impact transactions. This includes the launch of a $700 million strategic capital deployment envelope, which is designed to back strategically important and higher risk initiatives here in Canada, where critical minerals projects are a key area of focus. The second pillar of our strategy is to enable domestic supply chains. So we do target the broader ecosystem, as I've mentioned, and that includes not just processing, but of course, recycling, clean technology, and enabling infrastructure. We want to help Canada capture and retain more of the downstream value and create resilience across the supply chain, so that Canada isn't just extracting from the ground and shipping ore abroad, but we are actually turning more economic value from the industry. We currently have an active portfolio of over 300 mining supply chain exporters that we support. We do this through bonding solutions, working capital support, indirect export financing. This includes, not just Canadian suppliers, it includes Indigenous businesses, and we're trying to help those businesses scale up to meet the needs of domestic mining projects. The third pillar pertains to leveraging global partnerships. Here, we're actively collaborating with international banks and export credit agencies and other federal partners to help accelerate project development around the world where there are Canadian trade interests. In order to, or in doing so, we're able to help Canadian companies expand their mining expertise abroad, tap into new markets, and enter new supply chains. Next slide, please. I've talked a bit about the value chain and securing the supply chain. So we are proud to support this sector. We think that it can have transformative impact on Canada in becoming a reliable and responsible source of critical minerals. And in addition to funding projects, we also support the industry from exploration, so supporting service providers, all the way through to the end stage of reclamation, the rehabilitation of those mines to natural environment. As examples across the full value chain, we ensure the exports of raw materials from Canada. We backstop the recommendation bonds that miners are required to have, which creates a bit more financial capability for them, flexibility. We will finance foreign buyers and foreign investment by Canadians. And we support Canadian suppliers to the industry with our full suite of solutions. So I'll give a couple of recent examples. You can find more detail on our website, but earlier in mid-June of 2025, we provided an innovative solution through bridge financing to a company called Torngat Metals to help advance the next phase of its Strange Lake rare earth project. This is anticipated to be one of the largest heavy rare earths deposits outside of China. It's the first time we've extended financing to an early stage mining project. We are excited because this project, once operational, is expected to employ upward of almost 500 workers and has a very strong focus on Indigenous recruitment from both Quebec and Labrador in the region to help drive economic reconciliation and community-driven development in the region. I'm keeping an eye on time, so maybe I will go to slide 11. Thank you. We've had a lot of questions recently in terms of what does the trajectory of our support to critical minerals look like. And I will say that we have a data set here for 2024, and you can see some of those pieces on the slide here. But we are working on extracting and getting better at refining our data vis-a-vis the critical minerals sector specifically. So I'll ask for patience for those of you who have questions about trends in our support. What we can do is point to a large portion of our business that facilitates critical minerals. We are one of the leading mining experts in Canada. I know that there are questions as well about our collaboration with the Major Projects Office in Canada. The Major Projects Office is separate and distinct. We are connected with employees of the Major Projects Office at various levels and collaborating with them in relation to their work to provide a one-stop window to align financing sources for major projects in Canada so that they are aware of EDC's capabilities in the sector They are aware of our ability to provide strategic advice, and they are aware of our arm's length operations to provide financing or other support to some of the projects in Canada that they are focused on. Slide 13, please. Thank you. I'm going to end by talking about our sustainability commitments. You heard earlier from Nicole about Canada's leadership and in the mining sector in many ways, including sustainability. And Canada does have a strong brand abroad in our Canadian mining leadership. We are at EDC, we have a very broad sustainability framework, and those pillars are focused on enabling responsible business, making sure that the transactions in the business that we support are aligned to industry and international standards. We have a commitment to advance our net zero goals, and in both a decarbonization as well as a growth in our sustainable carbon finance business. And we have worked very hard to embed a broad cross-section of ESG issues across this organization, all the way from financial crime to good governance, sustainability, environmental, health and safety, social and human rights. Next slide. To give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, for the business that we support both, we undertake due diligence in both credit risks as well as non-credit risks. And I think that most of the interest in the audience in the call this morning is most interested in our non-credit risk analysis. And this is where we seek to understand what the potential risks and impacts of a transaction or a project in the mining sector's case may be. And then we work with the transaction counterparts or project sponsor to receive and ensure that their environmental and social impact information, that their environmental and social management frameworks, systems, budgets, and other commitments are aligned to expectations in accordance with international standards. And then we work through any gaps that we see within that framework with them. That last slide, please. Thank you. I'll end on this slide, but happy to take questions later on in the panel. This is an illustration of our project-specific due diligence process under what is called our Environmental and Social Review Directive, which is a legal requirement for EDC to review and assess projects that we may enter into support. We disclose our support to projects, Category A and B projects or Category A projects under the ESRD. We undertake due diligence. We will put conditions in place in that process to make sure that compliance is expected, to make sure that any subsequent deliverables are provided to us on time and in the right content. And then we work with a company throughout the duration of our support to monitor their operations to make sure that they're maintaining our expectations in accordance with international standards. So I know that was a lot and very broad coverage, so I will pause there and always happy to take questions later on.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much for sharing with us, Leah. Next, we have Jamie Keane, MiningWatch Canada's Outreach Coordinator and Canada Program Lead. He is responsible for MiningWatch's work in Western and Northern Canada, national and international policy areas, strategic research and communications, and the organization's Africa program. Go ahead, Jamie.
Thank you, Georgina, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending where you are, or good evening for that matter. And thanks for the invitation to be here. So I'm just going to jump right in and maybe take a bit of a step back and ask why we are hearing so much about critical minerals. In the last 5 years, basically, we've heard this whole discourse coming to the fore. And I would characterize it basically as just the latest of decades of projects on the part of the mining industry to rewrite the narrative of mining yet again, to legitimize mining and build social acceptability while obscuring or even justifying its real-world impacts on rights, on people's lives, on the environment, and on economic equality. And why are we doing this again? Basically, and I think we're seeing this in the presentations, to be able to accelerate the expansion of mining across Canada and globally. Now, there is a myth that Canada is a mining country, which carries symbolic weight, and mining is important in some regions of the country. But even at that, most of the wealth is generated for investors, not for workers or governments, including Indigenous landowners, whether domestically or internationally. And there's a lot of research on this showing the flows of wealth uh, from mining in every part of the world, including parts of Canada, into Toronto, into Vancouver, and into the pockets of the investors. Whereas the benefits are exaggerated, the mining industry, you'll see them counting taxes paid by their workers as part of their contribution to the economy. They will count indirect jobs using multiplier factors that are quite dubious. And in point of fact, part of the problem is that mining is taking the place of other economic development and is supported by governments over and above economic diversification and other work, so that in fact we're looking at jobs and indirect jobs that would exist anyway. So the contribution then is again to the industry and not necessarily, if at all, to communities and even governments. Just to turn a moment to those real world impacts that I mentioned, we're talking about division and conflict within and between communities around those projects. Are they good for the community? Are they healthy for the livelihoods of those people? Are they healthy for democracy? And there's a lot of these projects generate a lot of conflict. And that conflict is exacerbated by the kinds of pressures that we'll be talking about shortly. We're talking about toxic spills and contamination, including the tailings and mine waste that are left behind for future generations to deal with for centuries and, in fact, millennia in millions and billions of tons. We're not talking small amounts of material, and we're talking material that continues to be dangerous, in some cases, essentially forever. We're talking about the loss and pollution of freshwater bodies, rivers and streams and lakes, entire watersheds and aquifers. We're talking about damage to ecosystems, forests, wetlands, and so on, and the loss of habitat and biodiversity. And we're talking about the forced relocation, the loss of lands and livelihoods, violent repression, including rape and murder. And finally, we're talking about the loss of irreplaceable non-renewable resources and the loss of, in fact, sovereignty of nation states themselves via investment arbitration to industry investment. Now, why is this definition of critical minerals important? Basically because it has policy and practical implications. The policy implications include funding, subsidies, as we've seen, the various mechanisms that have been outlined, ranging from infrastructure spending to tax benefits to tax expenditures. These are all basically either channeling existing taxpayer money to the industry or foregoing tax revenue by giving it back to the industry in the form of tax breaks. Everything from flow-through shares to accelerated depreciation allowances and so on. We're talking about fast tracking. We've seen, Bill 15 in BC, Bill 5 in Ontario, the federal Bill C5, so the Building Canada Act, the Ontario Special Economic Zones, and a whole raft of related measures. which are basically amount to a continuing program of deregulation and bypassing existing regulatory safeguards. Everything from environmental assessment through to mine closure and rehabilitation. And essentially, overall, it adds up to uh, a broader social license effort, a real public relations effort, ranging from government talking points up to and including government ads. We saw during the World Series, the Ontario government promoting the Ring of Fire, whatever that is. And in practical terms, and you'll see these little graphics indicating the promotional material from the mining industry is apparently working. Um, these these work practically by bypassing or curtailing economic rights and environmental safeguards, by putting pressure on communities and governments, as I alluded to before, including Indigenous authorities, from limiting their ability to participate through to offering money or at least loans as economic reconciliation. And as is, I think, familiar to anyone who's been following this industry, promises of wealth that are simply not borne out in practice. And there are certainly parts of Canada, Northern Ontario, let's say, that have generated literally billions of dollars of wealth for investors, and where what's left is, let's just say the streets are not paved with gold, they're full of potholes. And finally, I think in terms of why this is important, it brings a real lack of transparency and accountability. All of this fast tracking, all of this promotion adds up to bypassing parliamentary accountability. Uh, we're seeing omnibus bills, no meaningful debate. We saw, the Building Canada Act pushed through Parliament with no meaningful debate. In fact, witnesses were called and then told not to bother coming. There's no meaningful review by committee, much less a more in-depth investigation of what the implication of these measures would be. We're left with a cabinet minister. No disrespect to the minister, but having one person making those designations of projects and initiatives is not democratic, and it's not accountable. This is decision-making behind closed doors, and even the criteria are secret. We're told by the Prime Minister that he has 4 criteria. They are so broad as to be meaningless, and the actual decision-making criteria and process are completely inaccessible to the public and even to other elected officials. The Federal Major Projects Office is secretive. We don't know what they're doing. We know that they have access to all kinds of resources. This is the gateway to all of these federal funding programs, but even its staff list is not public. It was actually for several hours. It was listed on the government directory, and I don't think anyone was quick enough to record it or download it before it disappeared. And now we don't know who even works there, never mind what they're doing. And I note that a number of these investments that the government is channeling to individual projects are in fact with private companies. And so there's no public disclosure required beyond the bare basics of where the company's registered. And although I think clearly the government would have the power to add disclosure requirements to these relationships, to say that's fine. We will, and we, through this secret process, we're investing in a private company, but at least we'll make public the basic corporate information of that corporation. What's their financing look like? Who are their shareholders? And that is simply not happening. And then we're talking about projects being endorsed that have very serious potential impacts or have already been identified as having very serious impacts. And I might highlight the Sisson mine in New Brunswick, which has been actually approved for almost 10 years federally and provincially, has not gone forward because it's a terrible project. It is incredibly low-grade tungsten. Less than 0.1% of the ore is actual tungsten. And so it will generate something on the order of 1 trillion tons of waste, of tailings and waste rock in a untouched watershed, untouched by mining, I should say, because obviously this is used recreationally, used traditionally by First Nations and so on in New Brunswick, but it is not a place where mining is happening. It is a place where there is in fact fresh water and sport fishing and so on. So this is not technically not a great project. It's been sitting there because no one wants to invest in it because of the costs associated with actually processing all that ore. And now investments from the U.S. Department of War and the Canadian government are aimed at making this project viable when it has no business being viable. Coming back to the question of what is being designated as critical, ironically, the Natural Resources Canada consultation in 2024 started off with a quote saying, if everything is critical, nothing is critical, and then proceeded to uh, add 3 more uh, minerals to the 31 already there. And this, you're not meant to actually read this slide. I understand that it's impossible to see. The point is that this is a comparison of various jurisdictions' critical minerals list, and the fact that um, it's all over the map. And you can just see that between different provinces in Canada, between the US and Australia and Asia and Europe and South America, um, some countries are very focused in terms of what they considered to be priority critical minerals. Canada's taken the approach of identifying 34 and then narrowing it down to 6. The point being that this is kind of a broad net, and what we're essentially doing is supporting the entire mining industry in Canada. Now, the initial rationale, going back to 2021 and 22, when this discourse really started picking up steam, it was based on the renewable energy transition. It was based on supply chain risks and priorities for building a low carbon economy. Um, so the focus was around renewable energy and electrification, so transportation, generation, and transmission and storage of electricity, the digital economy. But then there's a broader sort of catch-all added to say, well, if there's an economic opportunity, then it's critical. And that, I think, is the key to why we now have 34 minerals on our list, because it's basically going back to the broader criteria, anything that is or can be or might conceivably someday be produced in Canada. More recently, we've seen this shift uh, in the Carney-Trump era to outright so-called national security mining for armaments, and more broadly, focusing back on that economic justification, anything we can sell to anybody other than the U.S., but actually, yes, the U.S. as well, um, supposedly to counter the economics impacts of U.S. tariffs, but we're not excluding U.S. ownership, and we're certainly not excluding sales to the U.S. In fact, we're trying to build them up. I don't understand the logic of this. Maybe someone can explain it to me, but I thought we were in a trade war with the U.S. and trying to diversify rather than continue to focus on this U.S. dependency. Um, and I think importantly, this is not necessarily actual production. And if we look at the broad range of projects and companies that are attracting support under critical minerals policies, it's more like anything we can promote to attract investment. So in some cases it's real, in other cases it's speculative. And again, the idea is to counter the economic impacts of U.S. tariffs, not necessarily on the actual production and the real economy of Canada, but on the investment climate and the attraction of investment to projects. And as I said earlier, many of these projects do not deserve to be supported. And I wouldn't be the first to observe that governments are really terrible at judging this on their own. That's why we have public engagement in things like environmental assessment to point out where local and public interests lie in reality, not just in political terms. And we see also that the digital economy has turned from a knowledge economy to an ignorance economy. Artificial so-called intelligence, data centers, cryptocurrency. We even have a cabinet minister dedicated to promoting, not regulating, artificial intelligence. No one wins a race to the bottom. Mining may be necessary to meet the material needs of the renewable energy economy, but it must meet higher, not lower standards of protection for the environment, for human rights, and indigenous rights. The present mania for fast-tracking economic exclusion zones and deregulation is therefore irresponsible, but it is also counterproductive, doubling down on the same policies that got us into this situation to begin with. And when it comes to technically complicated projects with extensive and long-lasting, if not permanent impacts, rushing into them with inadequate consideration or even engineering due diligence is just asking for trouble. We're talking about what we need is a Canada brand based on real accountability. I'm going to wrap it up here, but I'm going to just say that what a more equitable future would look like is one that focuses more on circular economy, on recognizing the real world impacts of mining on communities and ecosystems, a limited capacity of both communities and ecosystems to withstand increased and increasingly harmful extraction, and the conflicts this pressure generates. I will leave you with a picture of that future or a picture of the present and where we need to go for that future, and encourage people to look up the Donut Economics Action Lab and the work that they've been doing over the last 6 or 7 years to build this idea of a livable economy on a living planet. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Jamie. Perhaps we can get more into some of the other things that you had to share in the Q&A period. In the meantime, while people are putting things in the chat, if any of the panelists in the Q&A, rather, if any of the panelists want to respond to those questions directly, you're welcome to do so. But before we get to the Q&A, we will hear from Associate Professor Nicolas Hubert in the Department of Societies, Territories, and Development at the Université du Québec à Rimouski. He is also the Canada Research Chair in Territorial and Socio-Environmental Transitions. Go ahead, Nicolas. We don't hear you.
Excusez-moi, vous m'entendez maintenant?
Oui, maintenant, oui.
I can
Merci.
hear you
Et vous
now.
me voyez également. Pardon, je disais merci à Georgina pour l'introduction, pour l'invitation à
Thank you,
partager
Georgina,
à ce
for
webinaire, et je remercie également
the
Jamie
invitation.
pour sa
And I
présentation.
would like to
J'avais
also thank
justement
Jamie for
approfondir la
his
question sur les
presentation.
impacts
I
réels
wanted
de
to
l'extraction
talk
des
a
minerais
bit
critiques
more
pour la
about
société
the real
canadienne, donc les
impacts
impacts sur
for
le
the
terrain,
Canadian
quels
society
conflits
of
socio-environnementaux cela
mining
peut
these
générer et quelles
minerals
seraient les
in
répercussions pour le
places
Canada.
where there
Je vais
are
me baser
potential
sur
social
l'exemple du
impacts.
Québec
And I am
en
going to talk
abordant
about the
en trois
Quebec
points.
example.
D'abord, les politiques publiques de transition
We
énergétique
have
et les
the
injonctions
public
contradictoires de
policy on the
développement qu'elles suscitent. En deuxième
energy
point, les
transition
mobilisations
and the
socio-environnementales
contradictions
associées au
that
développement
generates.
minier ainsi que
Then we
les
have
effets cumulatifs de
the
l'extraction des minerais
environmental
critiques. Et en dernier
regulations
point,
surrounding
j'aborderai
the extraction of
les
critical
enjeux
minerals.
que cela représente au niveau
And
provincial,
finally, I am
national
going to
et les
talk
possibilités de
about
jonction
the
d'acteurs.
challenges
J'ai
for
souhaité
various
construire cette présentation
stakeholders
selon
and
une ligne
levels of
presse
government,
pour vraiment
provincial
montrer comment cela
and
se
federal.
transpose dans la réalité de nos concitoyens et concitoyennes.
I also want to
Alors,
show the
Pendant
impact that
qu'on
this has on
fait
our
mais on voit
citizens.
vos
Nicolas,
notes dans
we
cette
can
version.
see
ok,
your notes in this version of
d'accord,
your
je vais
screen
passer.
share.
Ok, excusez-moi. Sinon, je peux juste éteindre. Est-ce que c'est mieux comme ça?
Is this better?
Oui.
Est-ce que là, je peux...
C'est la même chose, mais Si
It's
c'est un
the
problème,
same.
c'est pas grave. C'est pas
But
grave.
if you are unable to do something about it,
Parfait.
that's okay. Oh,
Alors,
Comme ça,
there
ça
we
fonctionne,
go.
oui, maintenant.
Okay.
ce que l'on sait sur ce que vous avez présenté sur les minerais critiques, c'est qu'il y a énormément
What we know about
d'investissements
critical
publics pour
minerals
soutenir
is that
l'extraction des
there's
minerais
a
critiques,
lot of
que ça
public
soit au niveau
investment
du budget
in critical
fédéral,
minerals,
au
both at the
niveau des
federal
différents
level
budgets provinciaux.
and the
Et c'est
various
vraiment
provincial
quelque chose qui est
budgets.
important où les gouvernements veulent accélérer cette
Governments
extraction
want
des
to
minerais critiques.
accelerate
La
the
présentation
extraction of
de
critical
Natural Resources
minerals,
Canada tout à l'heure disait qu'on veut doubler
and Natural
l'extraction
Resource
au pays
Canada
d'ici
said
2040, ce qui
just
représente
previously
vraiment
that they
des
want to
impacts
double
financiers, mais également des
extraction,
impacts territoriaux très
which has
conséquents.
important
On veut accélérer
territorial and
cet investissement,
financial
cette transition-là.
impacts.
On parle vraiment dans la situation du Québec, mais des différents territoires, c'est un boom des
For
permis
Quebec and other
d'exploration miniers,
territories,
ainsi
this
que
means
de
a huge
l'exploitation et des mines. Donc,
expansion
on est vraiment
of
sur un renouveau
licenses
minier, un renouveau
for
extractif
mining,
dans l'économie canadienne. Et
and
ça
there's
ça
really
se porte
a new
concrètement sur le terrain
wave of
avec des
activity in the
contradictions
mining
sur
sectors,
les politiques publiques de développement.
which has a huge
On,
impact on the
on a
public
déjà, vous
development
savez que
policies.
le Canada est fortement impliqué également pour lutter contre les
You
changements
already
climatiques.
know
Ça fait
that
partie des
Canada
justifications
is
de la
very
transition
active in
énergétique et de
trying to
l'exploitation des
reduce
minerais critiques.
their
Et
climate
cette lutte contre
impact.
les changements climatiques implique
And
également
this
des
fight
investissements
against
massifs
climate change
dans ce qu'on appelle la
means
conservation de la biodiversité, qui
huge
a d'ailleurs
investments
mené
in the
aux
conservation of
accords
biodiversity
issus de la COP sur la
in
biodiversité
line
de
with
Montréal 2000, la
the
COP 15
COP
qui a
agreements,
tenu, qui a,
notably
comment dire,
the
qui a
COP
abouti à
15,
l'accord d'initiative 3030
which
avec une volonté de
resulted
protéger
in the
30%
3030
des espaces terrestres,
initiative,
30% des espaces maritimes
protecting
d'ici 2030 pour
30%
chaque
of
pays.
land
Mais
and
cela amène des
ocean
investissements
or water
conséquents sur des
terrain
objectifs opposés. On
by
parle
2030.
d'extraction de ressources, donc de
We
destruction
have
de
therefore
l'environnement, mais
some
aussi pour soutenir
competing
la transition énergétique
objectives.
d'un côté et de
On the
protection
one
de
hand,
l'environnement
we try
de
to
l'autre côté.
expand
Et
the mining
c'est vraiment des
industry and
investissements massifs des deux
mineral
côtés, à la
extraction,
fois des
and
provinces
on
et
the
du
other
gouvernement fédéral.
side, we
Et
try to
ces
protect the
ces
environment.
investissements, parfois, même très souvent, se concrétisent au sein d'un même territoire. Et donc,
Very
on va avoir
often,
vraiment des objectifs complètement opposés
this
qui
happens
peuvent
in a
se
very
superposer sur un
limited
territoire et dont chaque
geographical
politique va avoir des conséquences
land
négatives
segment, and
pour
so
l'un ou l'autre programme.
both
Et
programs
c'est
are
vraiment
competing
un enjeu très concret qui va
in
se
a
concrétiser
tremendous
et qui
fashion.
va contribuer à l'accentuation d'effets cumulatifs à la fois au niveau social, à la fois au niveau économique et au niveau
This means
environnemental.
cumulative
On parle d'effets
effects on the
cumulatifs
social,
d'une part parce
economic,
que
and
ces projets
environmental
antagonistes se superposent
level.
au sein d'un même
These
territoire. On va
antagonistic
souvent
projects
observer l'exploitation de minerais critiques
are
en
then piled up
périphérie
on
immédiate
top of each other,
d'aires naturelles protégées, mais également parce
and
que ces projets se
this is
multiplient
added
sur
to
ces
some
territoires où on va
protected
avoir des aires
natural
protégées ou des
habitats
réseaux d'aires naturelles
and
protégées qui vont être
areas
peu à peu ceinturés de
which
projets
are going
d'extraction
to
des
become
minerais et qui vont être
surrounded by
saturés aussi
extraction
de projets
processes.
d'exploration minière. Et ces effets cumulatifs sont d'autant plus importants à prendre en considération que
So
les
it's very
études d'impact
important
actuellement portées au Canada
to
ne tiennent
also
absolument pas
consider
compte
that the
ou
impact
d'une façon
evaluation
minime,
studies
d'une part, la
currently
multiplication
in
d'un projet
Canada
sur un même territoire, mais
do not
également les effets
really
cumulatifs pouvant être
consider
associés au
these
changement
cumulative
climatique.
effects
Savoir
with
que
climate change
les
or the
pressions
cumulative
exercées
effects
sur l'environnement
of
peuvent
other
accentuer
projects
et
operating
engendrer
in the
des effets
vicinity or
exponentiels
on the
des
same
changements climatiques.
territory.
Donc on a un résultat très concret au niveau socio-économique,
Therefore,
mais
we
on a
have
également sur
important
l'anaturement de ces politiques
impacts
publiques
on the
un effet
social
qui va
and economic
minimiser
levels,
les résultats positifs attendus de ces politiques publiques et ça peut également
and the
contribuer
public
au
policy,
désengagement des
therefore,
populations des
is quite
communautés riveraines
eroded.
de ces projets par rapport à ces politiques publiques. Ici, j'ai repris
We
les
have
cartes
here
réalisées par
some
MiningWatch
maps,
Canada et la coalition pour que le Québec ait meilleures mines, où on voit vraiment l'ampleur
and
du
we
développement
see
minier avec
here
les plaines minières
how
dans
extensive
la
the
région du sud du
mining
Québec, entre
development
l'Outaouais
is in the
et
south of
le nord de
Quebec,
Montréal. Et on voit
between
comment cela impacte aussi les aires naturelles
Ottawa
protégées,
and the
à savoir
north
que
of
sur cette
Montreal.
carte,
And we also
la
can
moitié des aires
see
naturelles protégées ne sont pas
that
mises en avant. Il y a
half
également de
of
nombreux
the
parcs
protected
nationaux et de
areas in
réserves
green
fauniques qui sont concernés,
are
comme
not
la réserve
really
faunique de
are
Masquibouche,
surrounded
ici
by
autour de la Matapénie, où il
basically
y a le grand
mining
projet de
projects.
Saint-Michel-du-Saint,
For example, here right next to Saint-Michel-des-Saints Park, we have a huge mining development. And this connects with the very fragile habitats and very fragile environments.
In the east part of Quebec and Gaspésie, the situation is similar. The situation is a cause for concern. It overlaps on many protected natural areas that are the target of major investments from provincial and federal governments. And this is something we can clearly see with Murdochville in Gaspésie. Its former copper mine will be reopened. It is on the critical mineral list for the Canadian transition. Those territories have reoriented with the support of the provincial and federal governments over the last decades around tourism, ecotourism. So there is an economic structure that is geared towards the quality of the landscape, promoting natural protected areas. So those economies have reinvented themselves and turned away from mining and forest exploitation. And this plan to further extract critical mineral is disturbing the new systems in place. This situation can also be seen outside of Quebec. We see it in Manitoba, in Ontario, where there's an increasing number of critical mineral extraction projects, sometimes directly in biodiversity conservation areas or right besides those spaces. When I say that there are contradictions, it's something that we can really see with government orientations in terms of developing the territory, mining extraction, forest exploitation, for example, are not in line with other government priorities. And it's important to mention this because this mining development happens with very limited impact assessments that do not take into account the impacts of the multiplication of sites, climate change, and interconnectedness of the different systems we're touching. So in Quebec, we've seen broad opposition in all the areas that are targeted by mining development in Ottawa region, in Lanaudière, in the east of Quebec, in Outaouais, in the Laurentians. There have been mobilization by citizens, but also mobilizations led by elected representatives, by municipalities that are against projects that are built top-down, that are imposed by the Canadian or Quebec government, sometimes in collaboration with foreign investors. It's the case of the U.S. Defense Ministry. In one example, you see examples of citizen mobilizations, provincial mobilizations. We see them at the national level as well. When we talk about cumulative impacts, those territories are not, blank pages. There have been social protests there before. There's a series of environmental campaigns that have been led there that mobilize Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And this opposition against the mining development that is increasing in the southern parts of the country are going to strengthen previous tensions that have already been built. So we're just going to see an increased rejection of those development policies. It's really important to take this into account. Another important thing, it creates a combination of actors. Some people sign agreements. The community in Manawan, for example, signed an agreement with the mine, but there are other people within the communities that can be opposed to the projects. That leads us to conflict and to allyship between individuals and coalitions, where provincial and national organizations start working together. It happened in the Outaouais and Laurentians region, where many municipalities joined a broader movement against mining activities. What we see here is another alliance for the Petite Nation region, the Matawini Coalition against mining to protect the lakes, other issues as well. It also has impacts on national, provincial, and federal mobilizations. Those issues at the local level are also located in political campaigns, whether at the provincial or federal level. The campaigns have an impact on politicians' campaigns. Sometimes it forces the political representatives to reframe their proposals. I'm going to end here. That's not at the heart of my research or the topic, but we have to talk about important geopolitical issues. It's very important not to have a blind angle. Those social, environmental conflicts that have security repercussions as well are important, because Canada is exposed to foreign interference, political interference. We've seen it with the French case in New Caledonia. It's a French colonial territory that's very much based on a mining economy. And over the last few years, they were instrumentalized by Russia and Azerbaijan around mining issues, and this created a lot of local conflicts. Yes, there were interference activities, but the heart of the matter is that there was a conflict within the municipalities around the extraction of mineral that laid the table for what happened after. It's important to think about the legitimacy of a project. No matter who wins, there will always be people frustrated. There will always be conflicts that can be instrumentalized by different foreign actors, different ideologies that try to target Canada or strengthen their own respective positions on the, global landscape. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nicolas, and thanks to all of our panelists for sharing your presentations with us. Before we get into some of the questions, thanks everyone for putting questions in the Q&A. A bunch have been answered already. I just wanted to give the opportunity to the panelists if they would like to respond to each other quickly, and then we'll get into some of the questions. Whoever wants to start can come off mic. Yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
Thanks, Georgina. I was searching in vain for the raise hand function that I'm used to on Teams. So thanks for noticing I came off mic. Yeah, thanks for this opportunity. I just really wanted to acknowledge Nicolas and Jamie in particular for their presentations. I think it's very useful to have different perspectives shared as part of this conversation. And it made me think that it may be worth providing a little bit of additional background and context regarding how the federal strategy came into existence. So we did launch a public consultation process in the summer leading up to the eventual publication of the strategy. So we had released a draft discussion paper outlining the objectives, areas of focus, and some of the initiatives that we were thinking about, including some of the regions across Canada that at least NRCan had identified at that moment in time as being high potential for critical minerals development. I'm really pleased to say that that engagement process, there was a lot of uptake. We received, I believe it was about 200-ish submissions from a variety of stakeholders and respondents, including industry, NGOs, PT governments, Indigenous communities, etc. So that was really useful for us as we continued to refine and eventually publish that strategy. And I did also just want to touch on some of the points raised around the ESG considerations and acknowledge that, of course, we are far from perfect. And I think, you know, from the government's perspective, the federal government, I should say, our presentation could probably do better of acknowledging the areas where there is still work to be done. But I did want to point to a few areas in particular where we are seeing some increased activity in that space. For example, on the international side, we're increasingly engaged through various multilateral fora on standards and traceability related to critical minerals in particular. There's work ongoing within Canada to try to identify and launch a digital credential to allow for better tracing of critical minerals through the supply chain. So I don't want to take up all of the airtime here. Definitely welcome, you know, the perspectives of other colleagues, but just wanted to acknowledge and touch on a few of those salient points that came out through the other presentations.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Anybody else, or should we jump into some of the questions? Yeah, go ahead, Leah. There you go.
My unmute icon has actually disappeared. And I got a notice saying you have to disconnect and rejoin, so let's not try that. I also wanted to pick up where Nicole started. You know, it's pretty obvious you have diverse perspectives here on this panel, which is, you know, a reflection of Canada more broadly. And I will say there are certain perspectives that are particularly important in the mining and critical minerals conversation because they compel greater rigor, they compel greater compliance, accountability, and that shared insight is important. You know, Nicole said, you know, no one's perfect and the system's not perfect, and perfection isn't our standard here. What's our standard is continual learning and improvement. So that we can better assess and better understand and make more informed decisions and innovate as we go, so that the impacts, which are real, and the risks, which can be high, are managed accordingly. And that tension, you know, that's going to continue to exist. But I do think that fora like this one that you're convening are really important for us to bring those perspectives together to say, let's have a conversation here and make sure that we're if not appreciating, at least understanding what the other lenses look through.
Yeah, thank you. Jamie or Nicolas, do you like to say anything additional, or should we move on?
Sure. I mean, maybe not specifically on that, but really looking at where Canada sits nationally and globally. You know, we like to say that Canada has the best regulations and the most responsible companies in the world. We don't, and I think I appreciate the work that's going on in terms of things like traceability. I would wish for a lot more transparency, as I talked about, throughout the system. You know, we do have the Extractive Sectors Transparency Measures Act and reporting, which is valuable but limited. And you know, there's a lot more that needs to be done in that respect. But we also need to strengthen our regulations and enforcement across the country. So federally, provincially, territorially, you know, we all we have to do is look at things like the Eagle Gold mine collapse in the Yukon to see how badly things can go sideways when they're not properly regulated and monitored. And it's sort of, and that's recent. We don't have to go back to earlier disasters or to the legacy of abandoned mines across the country and the sort of irresponsibility of investors to follow up because they have legal protections to enable them to get away with things. But, we also need to be able to institute and enforce mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence on Canadian companies operating internationally. Uh, you know, a lot of our organizations have been working in this direction for a couple of decades now, and um, seeing very little progress from the Canadian government, um, very little even recognition that there's an issue. Um, Far from applying Canadian environmental and human rights standards, we're not applying any standards at all. We're not making any imposition on these corporate investments. And, even when it comes to the investments themselves, like we're allowing Canadian Stock Exchange to be used to fund environmental and rights violations. How is it that Canadian companies are able to promote activities that Canada has actually prohibited, like deep sea mining? So these are, kinds of things that sadly keep me up at night.
Thanks, Jamie. And Nicolas, would you like to jump in? Go ahead.
Oui, s'il vous plaît. J'aimerais préciser ce qui est
Yes, please.
mon
I
point de
would
vue, mais
like
pas mon point de vue.
to
En tant que chercheur, bien sûr,
specify
je suis pas
what
neutre
my point of view is, what
j'ai ma
my point
propre
of view is not.
subjectivité,
I'm a researcher and I have my
mais
own
j'aimerais
subjectivity.
juste dire que la multiplication des projets miniers sur un même territoire, leur jonction avec des
To
aires naturelles protégées,
multiply
ce n'est pas un point de vue,
mining
c'est un
projects on
fait
the same
qui est objectif,
territory,
on ne peut pas nier
this is not a subjective fact.
l'imposition
This
de
is what
projets miniers dans
is
des territoires
happening.
qui possèdent d'autres enjeux conflictuels est un fait également,
And to do this
et ça génère
on
des
land
des
that
effets
has
cumulatifs.
other
La contestation des
conflicting
projets miniers par les
priorities,
communautés
for
riveraines
example,
est
environmental
quasi
priorities,
généralisée.
really
En fait,
generates
là, c'est
difficulties.
l'opinion des personnes qui sont concernées, des communautés qui sont concernées par les projets miniers.
The
Elles sont
communities that
mobilisées et en général
are
opposées à ces projets
affected by
miniers. Ce n'est pas mon
mining
point de vue, c'est
projects
celle
are
des
usually
communautés.
opposed to them.
Et
This is
en tant
not
que
my
chercheur,
opinion.
mon
This
point de
is the
vue est qu'il est
community's
important
opinion.
d'interroger ces effets
And
cumulatifs
for
pour comprendre les
researchers,
impacts
it's important to evaluate
socio-environnementaux que cela peut
these
avoir et les
cumulative
conséquences
effects
sur les
and their
représentations et les pratiques politiques.
environmental
Ça, c'est mon point de vue en tant que chercheur.
impacts.
Et j'aimerais ajouter mon point de vue en tant que citoyen canadien.
And as a
C'est
Canadian
que je suis tout à
citizen,
fait
I
d'accord,
would
on
like
a
to
besoin de la
add that
transition
I
énergétique.
agree that we
L'exploitation des
have to
minerais
operate
critiques
an
est
energy
nécessaire pour cette
transition
transition
and that we
énergétique.
need
Et
to
si nous
get
avons le
critical
même modèle
minerals. But if
extractif
we
pour lequel il y
have,
a des
have
décennies
to keep
d'études
the
scientifiques
same
qui démontrent que
extractive
ça a des impacts
model
environnementaux
that
majeurs,
has
si nous gardons
been
ce même modèle pour faire la transition énergétique,
proven to
on ne
be
pourra pas atteindre
very
nos objectifs et au
harmful
contraire, on
by
accumulera
so much
des
research,
enjeux sociaux, environnementaux et économiques
well, we
totaux
are
au
setting
sein de notre
aside
pays qui
really
contribueront
important issues
à enrayer tous les
in terms
processus
of
que nous mettons
social
en
and
œuvre pour
economic
lutter contre le changement
development.
climatique.
Great, thank you very much. Excuse me. I'm going to read or summarize a couple of questions and then pass it over to everyone, and then we'll try to fit in another round if we have time. There are a few questions asking about the uses of resources, such as the extreme necessity for the use of water resources that might be in areas with prolonged drought. Another question about planetary boundaries, as Jamie brought up, and how we're using, how we're exceeding planetary limits, and sort of the long question, but just to say how we are balancing, or how we should be balancing the planetary, not exceeding or reducing the planetary limits that we're currently exceeding with the with the needs that we have as citizens. I don't think I explained that very well, but you have the questions there that you can read. That's one type of question. There's a question about how much investment in Canadian mining projects is coming from U.S. government defense agencies. I'm not sure if any of you are able to answer that question, but that would be great to hear. And so a question for Nicole about what does the Critical Minerals Initiative do to ensure the reuse and recycling of critical minerals and keeping them out of landfills? And then one last one to tag onto this round would be it's also for Nicole, but anyone can answer. Given gold and silver are correctly, in their words, correctly not included as critical minerals, will the government be implementing programs to encourage that resources, human and capital, are focused on critical minerals and any programs that encourage gold and silver, such as flow through shares, depreciation under the Tax Act, etc.?
Maybe I will start if that's okay, just because I realize a few questions were tagged to me. I'll try to kind of take a few of them in thematic groupings, and I do know I responded to a few, so hopefully the answers are available to everyone on the call. So maybe I will start first with the question around the list, which I know Jamie touched on, and so did Leah in both of their respective presentations from different angles, which was great to see. So the list, I would say, is really in two components. Like, one is identifying the methodology by which commodities are then assessed in kind of part two. And I know that I had flagged in my remarks that our intention is to keep that list up to date about every 3 years. What I failed to mention is that also includes the methodology being used to identify commodities for inclusion. And I think that's important to recognize, given how quickly things have evolved since 2021, when the list was originally put in place, to 2024, when the list was updated, and even between 2024 and where we find ourselves now. And part of how that list comes together and kind of helps frame from the federal government's perspective where we're putting emphasis in terms of programming and supports is a public consultation process, which includes provinces and territories, advocacy groups, NGOs, et cetera, a wide berth of different stakeholders and participants to really make sure that we're getting a diversity in views, and taking that into consideration in terms of the assessment. And often I will say that the views we receive or the comments we receive from folks through that public consultation process also make strong linkages to how the list will then be used to inform programming. With respect to some of the environmental considerations around water, land use, I'm also going to tie in some of the social considerations I saw flagged in the Q&A around human rights and community acceptance. Those are definitely still areas where there is lots of room for improvement. I'm not going to pretend that we are where we need to be by any means. I do think it's important to acknowledge, though, that where I sit, NRCan has a relatively defined mandate, and not everything is within our purview, which creates some challenges that I think are worth noting and being transparent about. So part of what we are doing is, through the governance of the strategy, is making sure that we connect with over 15 different departments and agencies who have various roles with respect to not just critical minerals, but natural resource development, and making sure that we are properly acknowledging as NRCan, where we sit as the lead for the strategy, recognizing some of these other considerations that, to be frank, may not be top of mind for us where we sit. So to give a few examples, we have the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada as part of our governance group, as well as the two federal departments responsible for Indigenous inclusion, capacity building, and Crown Indigenous relations in Canada. So what that has allowed us to do, for example, is hear information about work that departments are doing around housing and infrastructure, more on the social side of things, to make sure that surge in mining development does not create undue pressures socially, environmentally, economically on some of these smaller, more remote communities, and that there is long-term planning in place for what the next 10, 20, 30 years will look like to ensure that mining is done responsibly. The last question I'll take just very quickly, recognizing the time, was the piece around US investments. I do not have an exact figure on hand, but the question is correct in acknowledging that there is US government investment, including through the defense agencies in the United States. I do think it's fair to point out, though, that the federal government, and that includes the direction over the strategy, is increasingly looking for trade diversification options. You may have seen last October, as part of Canada's presidency over the G7, we had announced, I believe it was 26 international partnerships around critical minerals. So we are really seeing a strong push to ensure that we're diversifying our bilateral and multilateral work in the critical minerals space, both from an investment perspective, but also around some of those other initiatives I touched on, like traceability and standard setting. There's exchanges related to geoscience, research, and innovation that really prove quite meaningful for Canada. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Or thanks, Nicole. Before we get to the others, I just want to add in, since we might not have enough time, a question for Nicolas. Pouvez-vous nous dire plus sur les mesures à prendre pour gérer?
Can you tell us more about the measures that we can take to resolve these conflicts?
Go ahead, Leah.
Leah.
Oui, bonjour Georgina. Il me semble que la question me soit dirigée. J'étais
Hi,
dans le module de
Georgina.
traduction.
I was in the
La question n'a pas
interpretation
été
module, and the question was not very clear. Perhaps you can reformulate the question.
La question, c'est pourriez-vous nous dire?
The question was.
Je ne t'entends pas.
Could you?
Non, ok. Je vais le mettre dans le chat. Et peut-être on peut commencer avec Leah et après vous pouvez répondre. Merci. Okay, go ahead, Leah.
Sorry, what was the question again? I'm just trying to find it. Is it in the chat?
It was just a summary of the questions that are listed in the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll sort of take the question as I heard you sort of iterate it to Nicole, which was the big macro question. In the ways you phrase it, I think in some ways, it's beyond EDC's mandate to give, a detailed response there. But in other ways, these issues are very germane to what we look at in our due diligence in our transactions. And I can give you I think the better way to illustrate that, give you visibility, to give you specifics. So when water tensions or water supply is a critical element of a project, and it's posing as a risk, like, we will intensively review those issues from a technical, environmental, social aspect. We will bring in expertise and academics and engineers and community programs to help assess and understand those issues. So they get extensive examination, and where we feel those risks are too high, we will refuse to support a transaction. And in other cases where we feel they can be managed, we may support them and monitor their management of those issues. This also comes through in, just good practice environmental assessment. A good practice environmental assessment is going to have a solid alternatives analysis that looks at why this project and what would the alternative to be to not having this project. And, you want to substantiate the risks and impacts with that analysis. And I think at a more higher level, that's where strategic environmental and social assessment comes in as a practice. And that might be a little bit more germane to the level of regulators as opposed to the expert credit agency. But that is the role of strategic EAs, to step back and take a stock and balance out priorities and permissions. I think, this panel is very specific to critical minerals, and some of the drivers we have here are pretty important ones in terms of national security, in terms of driving the clean tech and the clean energy revolution forward. And, what we see from Canadian exporters and businesses here in Canada is an actually incredibly high level of innovation that's emerging. And, there's a West Coast project that's looking at lithium recycling and recovery that, we want that practice to be exported around the world. We want that technology to be adopted. Somebody else on this call has already pointed out the importance of looking at recycling technologies, for example. And, Canada does have some leadership here, and it is what the world needs in many ways, and we're keen to help deliver that.
Thanks, Leah. Since we're short on time, I'll just give 30 seconds to Nicolas if you want to touch on that question, and then if people continue to have questions and want to continue these conversations, of course we can do so via email or in other discussions that we're planning on having, such as the in-person event on February 11th. The info about that is in the chat, and I'll put it there again. But go ahead, Nicolas, and then we'll wrap up.
30 seconds pour répondre à une question
30 seconds to answer a question that literature has tried to answer for many decades. It's really hard. So I'm going to follow up on what Leah said and talk about regional limits. We also mentioned planetary limits, but it's important to look at regional limits. If we overstep them, it can really have an impact on ecosystems. Instead of extracting new resources, we have to recycle the resources we already have. Critical minerals are not new. They've been used by the industry for decades. We have to extract those minerals from residues, from waste, from existing minerals. It's what Quebec is trying to do right now, trying to extract minerals in mining residues. It's not interesting for private investors, but it's interesting for public investors to create a chain of value that is based on other mechanisms, on a new economy. But if we keep focusing on markets that are geared towards the benefit of a small number of private investors at the expense of a large number of citizens, that's where we have problems. There's only one way to mediate this conflict in a democratic system. It's through votes, and there will always be frustrated groups of people and conflicts that will perdure. So we have an extractivist model that is based on the wealth and the enrichment of a small number of very privileged elites. And we are in a race to lower environmental restrictions and so on. And the impact will always be larger on ecosystems, on populations, and on public finances that will then have to pay to mitigate the environmental and social impacts that have been created in the interest for the profit of private investors. This will always, this cycle would just continue. It's the cycle that we've been seeing for 3 centuries. It's the model which our society is based on it, but we have to take into account political and social and environmental factors to solve this problem.
That's a big question to ask. To summarize very quickly, but I appreciate your effort at doing so. And again, we will continue to have these conversations throughout the series that we're working on, as well as in our regular work. So please feel free to get in touch with us if you have further questions. I really want to thank the panelists for being with us today and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thanks everyone again for attending. We hope to see you on the 11th. Take care.